The American Civil War was America's bloodiest war. It began in 1861 and ended in 1865. Through all this bloodshed, however, was a great victory for America. One of the things that led to this great victory was the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. This took effect on January 1st of 1863. What this did was it freed the slaves in the Confederate states that were currently in rebellion. So it did not free the slaves in the loyal Union states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. It also allowed African Americans to serve in the Union Army. And this became a huge win for African Americans because it changed the goal of the war, allowed them to fight for their freedom, and led to the total abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the goal of the war to ending slavery rather than just preserving the Union. Lincoln was personally opposed to slavery, but he had to determine whether or not emancipation was constitutional. He knew that he couldn't free all of the slaves, especially not in the loyal border states. But he determined that it was constitutional because it was a military necessity to weaken the Confederate Army. The Confederates heavily relied on slave labor, so to take away their slaves was a big hit. Still, Lincoln had to wait until the right time because the Union had not yet won a major battle in the East. After the Union victory in the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln released the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This warned the rebels that their slaves would be freed on January 1st if they did not rejoin the Union. War was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was now about freeing the slaves. This gave the North a large moral advantage, and it also discouraged Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed African Americans to fight. It granted African Americans the ability to enlist, and over 179,000 African American men served in the Union Army, and nearly 20,000 more served in the Navy. This consisted of free Northern African Americans and runaway slaves from the South. Recruitment of African Americans was initially low until effort was made to enlist black volunteers. Leaders like Frederick Douglass urged free black men to join in order to ensure eventual citizenship. Many of the African American men in the Civil War served in support roles, such as nurses, cooks, and blacksmiths. This was because Northern officers didn't believe African Americans would fight. Still, African Americans played a major role in the Battle of the Crater during the Siege of Petersburg and in the Battle of Nashville. They majorly helped the Union forces win the war and pave the way to their freedom. This eventually led to the total abolition of slavery. Lincoln realized the emancipation would have no basis after the war because it was originally intended as a war effort against the Confederates. So they began working on a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. This passed the Senate on April 8th of 1864 and passed the House on January 31st of 1865. It was ratified by December 6th, 1865, and formally abolished slavery throughout the United States and its territories. This then led to the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to African Americans, and then the 15th Amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote. These are collectively referred to as the Civil War Amendments because they all basically started from the Civil War. And they all began with the Emancipation Proclamation. Overall, the Emancipation Proclamation was a huge win for the African American community. It greatly improved the lives of African Americans because it changed the focus of the war and it announced the end of slavery as a goal of the North in the war. It allowed African Americans to join the fight and help the Union claim victory over the Confederacy. The issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation was also the very first step toward the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which all greatly benefited African Americans. Even though many argue that the Emancipation Proclamation did not actually free the slaves, because really it didn't. It was a war effort to take away resources from the Confederacy, but it was the first step, and Abraham Lincoln considered it his main achievement during his presidency. So it was a win overall for African Americans.